Thanks very much, Bill. I'm not sure I can do better than that. I'm much more obedient than Abhijit, so I'm going to do exactly what Bill told me to do, which is I'm going to talk about some of my reactions to the book, which is going to be over there for signing later, and I'm going to talk about randomized controlled trials. I think, as always, it's hard to meet Abhijit or Esther or both of them together and not agree with a tremendous amount of what they say. I think, for instance, we would have almost exactly the same attitude to Jeff Sachs's candidature for the president of the World Bank, for example. I think we might share the same view about Paul Collier being president of the World Bank, though my guess is we'd sharply disagree on my favorite candidate, who's sitting on my left here, who I think would make a terrific president of the World Bank. Though probably start by closing it down. So let me start by saying some of the things I do like. Doing economics in the field has been a big change. You who are young don't realize that, but it used to be very rare in academia. Not a long, long time ago, but for many recent years. It's very important for good economists working with poor people and seeing how they live their lives. Economists have traditionally worked by a process of deduction based on introspection, and introspection turns out not to be a really very good way of understanding the lives of people who are very different from us, or maybe would not be very different from us if we had a lot less money than we do. And perhaps there really is a poor economics which is different from standard economics, or at least it focuses on very different things. This is built up, and the book makes a start on it, from on-the-ground experience and close observation. There are lots of stories. You heard Abhijit tell some of them just now. Experiments and the beginnings, though not, I think, the end, of coherent accounts. I also much like the fact that the book, unlike almost all books on development economics, reports the sums of money involved in purchasing power parity adjusted currency, which is very important. I especially like the fact that they use my PPPs rather than the official ones, and I much like, of course, the generous citation of my work. In fact, beyond that, one of the things that's quite notable about the book, and I'm not kidding here, is the enormous range of generous citations right across the profession. I mean, there's almost no one who works in development economics over the last 20 years whose work is not cited somewhere along the way. And I think that's a wonderful thing to have done. However, I was not asked here to come and agree, and there are quite a bunch of things that I don't agree with. And I'm going to talk about 3 points. One is thinking large and thinking small, with that homage there to Danny Kahneman's new book. And then I'm going to talk about randomized controlled trials, both in practice and in the ideal world of a randomized controlled trial and what you might learn in a perfect world. And then I'll say something to summarize at the very end. You all know by now what a randomized controlled trial is. I just in a moment of panic before I started, I thought I'd define it there. One of the things I'd like to do before I go on is acknowledge my work on randomized controlled trials, much of which I'm going to talk about today is new work, is joint with my friend and collaborator, Nancy Cartwright, who's a professor of philosophy and logic in London, and who's been interested in these issues for a really very long time. So let me first talk about thinking large and small. So Abhijit and Esther don't like grand schemes. They have a lovely phrase for them in the book, what they call the detritus of instant miracles, and indeed development is full of these abandoned wrecks at the side of the road of grand ideas from the past. They make a lot of fun of straw men. I bet my friend Bill here did not know he was a straw man until he read Poor Economics, what they call the demand and supply wallows, neither of whom apparently believes in evidence. And of course, there's a lot of code words going on here, because they mean by evidence randomized controlled trials most of the time, though not exclusively. And it's really the nature of evidence and what sort of evidence is relevant for policy that really is the crux of the debate here, and what counts and what doesn't really count. Instead, they want to fix the small things, finding out what works using randomized controlled trials. At some level, we all agree that making things work better is a really good thing. And at the risk of making a little bit of fun of it, it clearly is a good idea to have a better lawnmower. A better lawnmower mows your lawn better than a worse lawnmower, and there's a great contribution to human well-being if all of us had better lawnmowers to mow our lawns. I grew up in Scotland mowing my father's lawn with what was essentially a pair of scissors. And I'm very sensitive to the fact that lawnmowers are much better than scissors for mowing lawns. The last time, I think, and Abhijit and I have only ever debated this once before, I emphasized what I'd written in the past, that I thought theory was really what was needed here. And Abhijit pointed out correctly, I think, that theory is too general to be of much help at the level at which many people need help. So we have to do experiments, and I think all of this is correct. But on the thinking large and small, we all know there have been these great oscillations over time in the way people think about economic and development. And I think there's an oscillation between thinking big and thinking small that's gone on for a very long time. And let me give you an example. If you go back to really the first years of the World Bank, and when I very first knew the World Bank, they really were full of a lot of real experts, engineers, road builders, dam builders, plumbers. And these people were real experts. They had a terrific amount of knowledge, often of working in really very difficult places, and they really knew what they were doing. They knew how to build a dam. They knew how to build a port. They knew what could go wrong. They knew how to maintain materials and so on. Economists were largely part of this process in terms of doing cost-benefit analysis, or if you like, social cost-benefit analysis, in support of these engineers, trying to decide which of the ports should be built and which should not. This approach over the years in the World Bank was abandoned in favor of what one might call big thinking. And it was not because they didn't know what those projects did. I mean, they didn't actually know what those projects did, but that was not what was bothering them. And, you know, it's a really legitimate criticism that's come out of the evaluation movement that we don't really know what these projects do. But back in the day, that was not really thought to a problem. But because they came to believe that doing small things well was a waste of time if the macroeconomy was a mess. And in those days, the way they would have put it is because prices weren't right, the exchange rate was overvalued because of large-scale distortions of markets. So you could finish up building ports in the desert or building dams where you never connected up the prices, and everything was measured wrong and everything was distorted, so you really got the wrong answer. And that led to a world of structural adjustment lending, of focusing on macroeconomic policy and so on. And that was a well-thought-through decision. It may not have been right, but it was a heavily debated, serious discussion. Now the argument would be more, perhaps less, in terms of getting prices right, but in terms of political failures and the failure of state capacity. Now, this argument I don't think has ever been fully concluded, and I think it really is more of an issue for poor economics than is fully admitted. It's really not clear that inventing a better lawnmower is a good idea if there's no grass, or if the government is dumping toxic waste on your lawn, or indeed, as is one of the themes of the book, that states should do more, can do more for the poor. But if these states are dysfunctional, it's not really going to work very well. Many of the recommendations of the book require more state capacity, that the state fill in and do things for the poor to help make their lives better. And there's an extraordinarily optimistic view of government that its prime purpose throughout the world, apparently, is to do what the market cannot. Of course, that's one definition of what government should do. But the fact that government, that's a descriptive, it's accurate description of the way most government works, I think is not true at all. And there's really no recognition of the fact that aid in at least some countries may be undermining the capacity of the state and the institutions that do not work for poor people. And I know the counter-arguments, and there's a chapter in the book on politics, and they've done important experiments on politics too, and fixed and made recommendations based on that. But these politics are still local politics. We're really still at some level talking about lawnmowers. And perhaps that's all we can do, and there's a very strong argument of that kind in the book, but I actually think not. I think we do have to address the big questions. And what really worries me is that we especially have to address the big questions if we're, that says implicit, it means if we're complicit. And if our aid flows in at least some African countries are seriously undermining state capacity, state ability to tax, we're doing harm. And while our governments are doing that, trying to improve schools in Western Kenya, when the government of Britain or the World Bank is pouring money into a very dysfunctional government, I don't think is a very productive thing to do. So let me talk about randomized controlled trials. And first I'm going to talk about practical randomized controlled trials. And we read over and over again in this literature that RCTs solve the selection and bias problems. They give you reliable answers to questions. That turns out to be false. And let me explain why. If you start from a parent population, which is, say, the whole population of the country on which you might actually want to do it, you might actually want to implement the policy, and that's a policy you're interested in. So this is like all the schools in India, or all the villages in India, or all the coffee farms in Africa, or something of the sort. From that population, you select what I call an experimental panel. Now, it's interesting that there's no real word for this in the experimental literature, which tells you that it's not well enough thought about. But this is, if you like, the 100 villages that are selected from the 1,000,000 villages that you could have selected from, and which are then divided into treatments and controls. Okay? So I want you to think of a two-stage process in which we select from the universe of all possibles the people we're going to do the experiment on, and then we do the experiment by randomly splitting them, and one half gets the treatment, and the other half doesn't get anything, and then we observe the difference. So just a classic description of a randomized controlled trial. So there are two stages, though. Now, the two selections from the parent and from the experimental and control, the absence of bias and selection applies only to the second stage. It does not apply to the first stage, or it doesn't always apply to the first stage. I will talk about that a little bit more. So if you think of the first stage, it's typically selected, perhaps just for convenience, or perhaps because you can't do the whole country, so it's done in some area of the country, or it's done in the capital city because that's a convenient place that minimizes transport costs. And you're always constrained, or not always constrained, but nearly always constrained when you're talking about individuals or schools or municipalities by the willingness of people to participate. So you can't bring people into the experiment who don't want to be a part of the experiment. So the population on which you can do this experiment is not a random representative group from the population as a whole. It might be, but it usually isn't. So the results at best apply from the population that you could have experimented on, not for the population in which you're going to do the policy. And therein lies the possibility of all sorts of selection and bias. Let me give you an example from pharmaceutical trials in the US. The pharmaceutical companies, when they do randomized controlled trials, always want to observe the pure effect of the drug. That means that children, for whom it's dangerous, and the elderly who have comorbidities are typically excluded from most drug trials. And yet, a huge fraction of all those drugs, when they're put into the market, are actually going to be consumed by the elderly and to some extent by children. So by definition, you're testing those on a population that's different from the population in which you're going to use them. Sometimes that invalidates it, sometimes it's not a problem, but it's a potential problem always, and it always has to be thought about. So if the experimental and the policy populations are different, there's a real problem. Now suppose then that there's not a problem at that first stage, so that the selection of the panelists is done randomly. So this would normally be the best case. So we have 1,000,000 villages in India, we take the list of all the villages in India, and we pick 100 villages, and we pick them, split them 50-50. So I've been playing on my computer with some pseudo-randomized trials. So I just make up a population of people or villages. There's a treatment effect in each of these villages. I select 100 villages, I split them in half, and I see what happens. And I do that thousands and thousands and thousands of times so I can get a good idea what would happen to people who were doing an experiment like that. And it turns out there's something that's actually quite realistic, which is a bit of a problem, which is if there are some people in the population who would benefit a lot from the intervention, and a lot of other people who wouldn't benefit very much. So the vast majority of people are people who, when you give them this microcredit loan, will get a little bit, but there's one or two out there and it'll completely change their lives. Or it may be on average there's no effect, but there's some people up there who do really well and some people who would lose out a little bit. Now the problem then is when you select your 100 villages, if you get one of these outliers in this experimental population, then everything depends on whether that's on the treatment and controls. So when I run through this on my computer and I look what happens, I get all sorts of weird outcomes. And in fact, there's some experiments in which half the time you get a big negative effect and the other half the time you get a big positive effect on the same sample. The t-values by which significance is judged, and Abhijit's been talking a lot about significance in those numbers, are way off. So you get huge significant effects. In my experiments, about 20% of the time, instead of the 5 when there's nothing there. I mean, in my experiments, there's nothing there, but you're finding spurious effects that don't exist, and you're finding them really quite frequently. So it's a real problem. Now, this would go away if those samples, if the randomized controlled trial was done in 100,000 villages, or if it was done on 10,000 villages. But if you're doing it on 100 villages, you're in real trouble. 100 villages is a big sample size by the standards of a lot of those randomized controlled trials. So what does that do? You get many spuriously significant, but very interesting results. I mean, look at this weird finding I find. Isn't this interesting? It defies conventional wisdom. And notice this is nothing to do with data snooping. It's nothing to do with searching until you find a result. This will happen even if you specify everything in advance and you do everything the way you're supposed to do this. You get contradictions though. People do other studies, even on the same population, and get different answers, and they get published and they often get a lot of attention, which is how I read a lot of the results. I spent a lot of time over the last month or so reading a lot of these papers so that I know some of what I speak. I have not read the whole literature for sure. The last time Abhijit and I were on a platform together, we were not debating, but Abhijit had a very interesting slide, which he very kindly sent to me, about his comments on what was happening on a lot of these experiments, especially on the consumer side. And so he also finds many counterintuitive, weird results, mutually contradictory, both on the face of it, meaning you get different answers in different, very similar experiments, and in terms of implying behaviors that are wildly inconsistent with one another. For instance, people have discount rates that are so high that you wonder how they could ever get out of bed in the morning. Abhijit, in his comments on this, says, well, we're failing to connect up the dots. And he says we need a better theory to do so. And he talked a little bit about that today, about behavioral economics and the greater approach of psychology, which I agree with, in trying to interpret these. But these dots may not be real. And I've got an analogy here. This actually happened to me once. I was sitting watching an avant-garde movie, and you didn't actually know whether you're stupid and you can't understand it, or whether the projector is broken down, or the projectionist has gone to sleep, or the movie is being operated by his dog in a sort of random way. And we were all sitting looking at this thing, exchanging hypotheses about what we were seeing, and then the artist happened to come into the room and he said, oh my God, the thing is stuck, and unfreed it. And you know, we were trying to make sense of something that was just complete random noise. And my sense is not that these are all random noise, but that at the size at which people are doing these experiments, and given the way the groups are selected, you're in terrible danger of trying to overinterpret things that have no interpretation because they're just bizarre noise. But the problem here is the way, and I've heard it in the room several times today, and it's all over poor economics, that randomized controlled trials get treated differently. they're not subject to the usual standard that we bring to other papers in economics, where we say, I don't really believe this because I don't really believe the t-values, or because you've really not done this right. As far as I know, and I've read it pretty carefully, there's not a single randomized control trial in poor economics that is criticized for internal problems, that whether it was really right or not. And my reading of several of those is really very different, that the sample sizes are too small to be credible, the results are sort of crazy. The other thing that is often said in response to things I just said are other methods are worse. And that's just not true either. You can make it true by defining other methods like regression or instrumental variables as what I call RCT wannabes. And if you define those things as failed RCTs, of course they're worse than RCTs because you've set it up that way. But in practice, that's not true at all, because the RCTs tend to be small. They're in very special populations. It may be if you collected household survey data, you could do it on a much wider population, much less selected. It might be there's some bias there. The bias, though, you might be closer to the truth much more often. And my argument here is not that you throw away all RCTs, but that you can't prioritize them and say an RCT, no matter how badly it's done, no matter how small it is, no matter how weird it is, must be better than any observational study, however well that is done. That is just not true. And if you were starting to try and analyze a project or do an evaluation, you have to decide on a case-by-case basis where an RCT would be better to do than some other method, or vice versa. And the answer cannot be determined by a religious belief in the automatic superiority of randomized controlled trials. So let me talk about the perfect RCT. Let's say that St. Mary's and St. Joseph's are two schools. There's a perfect RCT which has been run by the heavens, and there's 1 million observations, and we know the answer for sure. St. Mary's is thinking of adopting this training program. St. Joseph's, a neighboring school, has adopted it, and it got an increase in test scores of Z, which is different from X, different from what came out of the trial. So what should St. Mary's do? Well, it's not obvious or even clear. And there's an elision in the language, which even Bill, when he was talking about his doctor this morning, what an RCT does is gives you the average. It doesn't mean it's good for you. And the average could be a big spread between people who've been hurt and people who've been helped. And if the average is positive, it means more people would have helped than hurt, but it doesn't mean you won't be hurt by this. So when people talk about drugs this all the time, they say RCT shows that it works, therefore it'll work for you. That is a completely unfounded inference from one to the other. So St. Mary's is not the mean, and it may be a long way from it. The mean is useful, and the Board of Governors of St. Mary's certainly should take that mean into account, and that mean may be very different from what they thought the mean would be, and that's important, but it's not decisive. St. Joe's may be much more like St. Mary's. It may draw its pupils from a similar catchment area. It may be that in the past, results that have worked in St. Joe's have worked in St. Mary's too. And perhaps even better, the board of St. Mary's could go to St. Joe's and see the new policy in action and observe the mechanism at work. Now, this is the key. The key is really observing the mechanism at work and seeing actually what happens. And here we go. So this comes to what Bill was saying this morning, and I didn't collude with Bill over this at all, which is the way to find out what works is not to do randomized control trials. The way to find out what works is trial and error. And trial and error sounds a lot like randomized control trials, but it's not. I don't know how many of you know the game of Angry Birds. The laughter suggests that many people do. Angry Birds is a game that comes on your iPhone or your iPad, and there's a bunch of birds shown over on the left there. There are 5 in this particular round of the game, and there's a catapult for firing the birds, and the idea is to hit all those green pigs over on the right there and blow them up because the pigs have done something nasty to the birds and so on. Now, I mean, when you play this, what you do, this is subject to the laws of physics in general. But just like, as I said before, the laws of physics apply here, but they're really too general to be very useful to solve this problem. You need some very, very specific. You know, when you shoot the things, they are in perfect parabolas. They do exactly what the laws of physics say they're going to do, but they don't, that's not enough. So what you have to do with this thing is you fire off a bird and see what happens. And then you fire off another bird, and you slowly learn, because you try it in many different ways, and eventually you figure out what'll work on this thing by a process of continual trial and error. Now imagine trying to do a randomized controlled trial on that. This is essentially impossible to learn this with a randomized controlled trial, and the technical reason is the dimensionality is too high. Now take this example where there were 5 birds, say about 100 angles each. That's even discarding that you're not going to fire the thing backwards, though you could. You're also allowed to goose these birds, so when they're flying through the air, you can touch them and it makes them go faster, okay? So there might be, for each of those, about 20 places where you can goose them. I suspect there are actually more than that. So you'd have to do a random controlled trial on 2,000 times to the power of 5, because after every trial, you'd have to do another trial, and you'd have to do all the sequential trials. Well, that's more than there are molecules in the universe. It's 3.2 times 10 to the power of 16. I don't know how many molecules there are in the universe, but that's a big number. And you know, you would spend all the money there is, even in the Soros Foundation, and you would never get there. And you know, but a child can learn this. My 4-year-old granddaughter can learn this in about 5 minutes, right? And she didn't do, you know, 3.2 times 10 to the 16 randomized controlled trials. And that's not the way, if you look at the way physicists work, if you look at the way the Industrial Revolution worked, if you look at how medical science worked, if you look at all the devices, all the procedures, the heart transplants, the hip replacements, all these things, they were all done by trial and error. A lot of people died, just like a lot of birds died. And people eventually figured out how to do this right, and now it worked. There were no randomized controlled trials for nearly all of these things. There have been a few done in a few procedures, but almost none. Let me conclude by, well, just 2 things. One is the visit of St. Joe's board, St. Mary's to St. Joe's, they can actually see the mechanism, what Nancy Cartwright calls watching the dominoes fall. It's like watching the Angry Birds hitting the pigs. You can see how it works. And if they can see that working, then they can often immediately see whether it'll work for them. Because they say, oh, this works because St. Joe's has that headmaster, it wouldn't work for us. Or they say, well, it doesn't work very well in St. Joe's, but we could make it better by tweaking this. So they could do a trial and error based on the mechanism. If they understood the mechanism, they can adapt it. An RCT does not tell us what's happening. It's essentially a black box, because you can't, it's a cross-unit design, not a within-unit design, and you can't see what's happening when you miss. And in fact, Abhijit and Esther know this, and throughout the book, they're very honest, and they describe the results of these RCTs, and there's a lot of presumablys, or they might have thought, or perhaps this happened because, or a story begins to emerge. They're a very different level of rigor from the rigor in the randomized controlled trial. And you saw Abhijit just now stitching together a story from all of these experiments. But you know, it's sort of a fairy story. The experiments don't tell you those stories. Those you have to make up in advance. You have to fit the experiments, but then of course I'm worried a lot of the experiments are not real results. So I think you're sort of in a mess, and I think it's really hard. Okay, let me finish with causality. One of the things that is often argued for RCTs, and it's true, I agree with this, is that it often identifies causality. You know it was your thing that made this happen because you have the treatments and controls. Now, in a lot of experiments, a lot of things we care about, the causality is really quite clear. Because, you know, we know, like in the Angry Birds, I know who fired the bird. I did it with my finger. You know, it's not, the causality is not really an issue. But the causality you get from a trial is what philosophers call Inus causality. It's often, and Inus means an insufficient but non-redundant part of a condition which is itself unnecessary but sufficient. When you see a sentence like that, you understand why most of us avoid philosophy like the plague. But let me give you an example. An example of Inus causality is a house burned down because the TV was left on. Okay, that's a true causal statement. If the TV had not been left on, the house would not have burned down. It's a causal statement. The TV being turned on caused the house to burn down. But TVs being turned on don't usually cause houses to burn down. And finding out that it was the TV that caused it is not a very useful piece of information for doing development policy or anything else. Nancy Cartwright has this wonderful example of a Rube Goldberg machine. I don't know how much of this you can see, but this is a pencil sharpener. It's the new improved pencil sharpener. And this works by opening the window on the left, whereupon the kite flies in the air. That pulls a string, which opens a door, which allows moths to escape, which then eat the shirt that's hanging off the ceiling. The shirt is now lighter, and that lowers the shoe, which you see next to it, onto a switch, which heats the iron, which burns the pants on the ironing board. That causes smoke to go up. It will enter the tree and smoke out a possum, which jumps onto a basket, which opens the woodpecker's cage, and the woodpecker jumps out and sharpens the pencil. So this is a way of flying a kite in order to sharpen a pencil. The knife at the end is there for an emergency if the woodpecker doesn't show up for work, and enhances the reliability of the design in general. This is an example of an Inus cause. You could set this up as a randomized controlled trial. It would work. You would discover that mechanisms like this work better than ones where the possum didn't exist. You could make this as robust as you want, but it's completely useless because by and large, flying kites does not sharpen pencils. And when you're doing a randomized controlled trial with your eyes shut, which is the definition of a randomized controlled trial, you're always subject to these sort of things. TVs don't always burn down houses or kites sharpen pencils. They need what Nancy Cartwright calls helping factors or context. Their operation is contingent on the context, which is why replication is of very limited use, because we know in advance that in many cases the helping factors will not be present. So you can't get around this problem by doing it over and over again. You just get a lot of different results. I'm almost done. So I'm summarizing. So we now have enough RCT papers to judge their quality and the evidence they claim. My reading is some are excellent. I thought I learned a lot. I knew things I didn't. Some are terrible, just like other empirical papers in development. They have to be judged case by case. There's no free pass just because they're RCTs. One of the things that did piss me off a little bit in reading Poor Economics was the word rigorous evaluation was used as a code word for randomized controlled trial. And there are lots of rigorous ways of producing evidence that have nothing to do with a randomized controlled trial. There's also a heavy use of the phrase careful thinking, which turns out to mean what we think, not what you think. And Poor Economics has no monopoly on rigor or on careful thought. One final complaint, and this does not come from Poor Economics. Here's a generalization. This appeared in a survey, published survey paper in a reputable journal, and it said provision of free school uniforms leads to a 10 to 15% reduction in teen pregnancy and dropout rates. Completely blank, unqualified statement. The next paragraph, in case you were wondering, refers to other results on school quality. We were told the generalization is more difficult. So the previous statement is presumably completely general. You wonder if it would work in Kansas, or in India, or in all-boys schools? Do you think teenage pregnancy would fall? I mean, this is just outrageous overreach. And doing this in the end is going to turn everybody against randomized controlled trials. And I'm not at all sure that that would make it a good idea. If you read about this same paper in Poor Economics makes it clear that even within some of the schools in this experiment, this effect did not happen. So they're much more careful than this paper that I cited. So it depends on which of the authors of the studies you're reading. But what is happening here is this thing that happens all the time with RCTs in medicine and in development, which is this illegitimate translation from it works on average to it works for all. And that's loose. My co-author Nancy Cartwright likes to say, loose words cost lives. those are loose words, they cost lives, and this is the opposite of careful thinking. Thank you very much.